streaming. All right, and I think everybody's here. Let me just double check. That's my phone. There we go. All right, so we're going to start today. I'm going to use today as the last lecture, and then tomorrow at about this time, I'm going to start the the final project. It's going to start tomorrow, and it won't be due until the end of Wednesday. So that's going to be what we'll be doing. So on Wednesday, I will sign in during this time. If anyone has any questions, we can I can answer those questions at that time. So it won't be a lecture. It will be more like just me being around and being able to try my best to answer the questions. I would put it that way. Yeah, but I'm gonna give you guys like more than 24 hours to do it. Yeah, so I'll get it ready and have it available for you guys to start tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. and it won't be due until right before midnight on Wednesday, because I cannot put it any past that point, because this class is ending on Wednesday, so I cannot have. Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. That is correct. It won't. Yep. Yeah. So you can basically start on it on one computer and then sign off, go to another computer, sign back in, and it'll still be there. Yes, it's going to be through Canvas. All right. Cool. All right. So I am going to. Oh, this is the port thing that I looked up last time. What port number corresponds to what service. It's kind of interesting. I think some of this stuff is going to be useful at some point of your career. All right. So I just wrote this today. I didn't have time. I have been sleeping like 4 hours. Maybe 5 hours a day, pretty much since April, because my I have a backlog of having to grade the homework and also the exams for my other classes. Basically since April, because I was hoping that in May I would start. Severe will be teaching this class, and I will be able to catch up, on some of my other classes, and that did not happen. So, I was basically backlogging all the way to the end of the semester, and so as a result, I basically started to do the research and work on this, in the morning. But I did find quite a few interesting things, and at least I identified the components and also what they do, and basically wrote about it. So here it is. All right. So this part, section 1 talks about our RackF. Okay, they actually have the proper pronunciation suggestion of RackF. It is your resource access control facility. It's basically the facility, the subsystem of ZOS that's responsible for authentication, for access control, and also for logging and reporting. So those are the 3 main functions of RackF. So we'll talk about authentication first. We talked about a little bit of this last time, so we're gonna be expanding a little bit more today. So by default, ZOS supports password authentication. Now, password authentication by itself is not too bad, but it is bad when you have a restriction of up to only 8 characters for your password, because that's not enough combination to stop dictionary attacks. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about dictionary attacks, in case not everybody knows about what a dictionary attack is. A dictionary attack is basically a hacker going through a dictionary of common passwords and try each and every single one until that person can get in. So there are not really a whole lot of combinations with 8 characters. Now, if you count all the randomly generated passwords, there's a lot. But if you only count words that make sense or combination of words that make sense, there is really not a whole lot if you have to fit a password into 8 characters. So I would like to ask, is that true? When you guys sign in through TSO or through your 3270 session, when you sign in using your password, is it restricted to only 8 characters? Okay, so that would be a passphrase, right? It has a different name. Okay. Okay, that really makes sense to me, that they have to expand that. The 8 character thing, I'm really sure that this is coming from way back when, when System 360 first came out. I think, this may be, coming all the way from the 60s. And obviously, it is not sufficient anymore by today's standard. So that's one way to sign in, is to use a password. The second one we talked a little bit about, there are certificates. So with certificates, last time when we talked about certificates, we were talking about certificates from the perspective of signing and also from the perspective of encryption. For signing, it's for authentication. How do you make sure a particular document was coming from a particular person or a particular company? So a certificate can do that. Basically, you use a private key to encrypt what we call a digest, which is a fixed length bit pattern, and you use a private key to sign that. You send that signed digest along with the document, and whoever receives the document would use the public key to decipher the signed digest, and then compare that deciphered digest with the actual digest of the document. If they match, then you have established authenticity of the document, or at least who sent it. So the same certificate can also be used for signing in and also for authentication that you are who you claim to be. I'm not really sure how many of you, or how many of your units utilize certificates for authentication, but it really is kind of cool and a lot more secure compared to passwords. So the process of using a digital certificate for signing in would be these 4 steps. So the first step is the user's computer would initiate the sign-in process by sending the certificate over. The certificate is going to contain a few things. It's going to contain at least the identity of the owner of the certificate. It will also include a public key associated with that person, along with a signature, hopefully from a certificate authority. But you can self-sign certificates. I looked this up to RackF can self-sign certificates. So if it's only for internal purposes, then you don't really need to pay money for a certificate authority to sign the certificate, because you can trust your own organization. So in that case, it can be self-signed. So the next step is the system will check the authenticity of the certificate by checking the signature of the certificate first, and if everything checks out, it's going to reply with a challenge. So the challenge coming back from the system that you're trying to sign into is a randomly generated string that is going to be encrypted using the user's public key. So the public key is public knowledge, and so there's no problem with letting everybody else know about the public key, because with the public key they can only encrypt stuff that is intended for your computer to view. And the public key is included in the certificate itself. So that's why the first step is to transmit the certificate over. In the third step, after receiving the encrypted randomly generated string, then your computer is going to decipher or decrypt the randomly generated string that was encrypted using the public key, because remember, your computer should be the only computer that has access to the private key. So whatever you encrypt using the public key, you have to decrypt it using the private key, and only you and your computer has the private key. So your computer is going to decrypt the private key, and then you can transmit the deciphered key, or the deciphered string back to the system. So now the system can compare the deciphered string and also the original randomly generated string. If they match, then they have established your identity, because only you are supposed to have the private key. So you have to remember, through this authentication process, all they're authenticating is, does the computer used to sign into the system have possession of the private key? Now, if somebody step into your workstation, okay, at home or at work, and initiate this process, there's no way the system can know that it is actually somebody else who started the whole process. So is that okay? Does everybody understand the whole process of how to use certificates, or the underlying mechanism of using certificates to sign into a system? Okay, no questions about this? Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, so the public key is included in the certificate when you transmit that to the system that you want to sign in. Okay, so who is trying to sign in? Okay, so you're trying to sign in. So let's pretend that I am the system. Okay, so I'm the IBM mainframe system. I'm ZOS, and you are trying to sign into ZOS. So the first step is for you to use your to send me your certificate. Okay, so you send me the certificate. I receive your certificate, and I look at your certificate. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is to authenticate whether that certificate is real or not. Okay, and I can check there's a signature included in the certificate, and so the certificate itself is supposed to be signed by some organization that both you and I can trust. So I'll first check that is the case. Now, if that is the case, I will extract the public key from the certificate that you just sent me. Okay? And that's perfectly okay. If somebody was eavesdropping this entire transaction, it's not a big deal, because everybody has access to the public key. Is that okay? Okay. So I, ZOS, okay, got your public key. So on the side, I'm going to generate randomly generate a string. So when I say randomly, it means, it is a very random, process. It's not just, pseudo random, because mathematically speaking, there are processes that it's almost impossible to be truly random. So I would do my best to actually truly randomly generate a string. Okay, so it's just gibberish. So what I would do, as ZOS, is to use your public key to encrypt that randomly generated string, and I'll send the encrypted randomly generated string back to you. Okay? So what your computer is going to do, receiving that randomly generated string that is encrypted using the public key that you let me know, is your system is supposed to be the only system that has the private key, and that's the name why it is called a private key, is nobody else is supposed to see it. So whatever I encode or encrypt using the public key, you can decipher using the private key. And there's only one person, supposedly, there's only one person in the entire world who has possession of the private key, and that's you. So your computer is going to use the private key to decipher the encrypted randomly generated string. So you should be able to get back to the original randomly generated string, right? So you're going to send it back to me and say, okay, TAC, I think this was the original randomly generated string that me, ZOS, first generated, a while back. So when I receive that the decrypted randomly generated string, I will compare that to what I actually generated, earlier, which I never told anyone about. If they match, then I know that you have access to the private key, because only the entity that has possession of the private key could possibly have known what the original randomly generated string was, other than the server itself, me. Does that make sense? Sort of? Yeah, I know it's tricky. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. That is basically the same thing as how to sign using a key pair encryption. Remember what we talked about last time about key pair, using how we can use a key pair to sign and authenticate. That's basically what that is for. So you can digitally sign a PDF by generating a digest that is encrypted using your private key, and you attach that private key, the private key encrypted digest, with the PDF. So whoever is getting the PDF can now verify and go like, okay, did Jennifer actually sign this document? They have access only to your public key because your certificate is public knowledge. So they have access to your public key. So they would use your public key to decipher or decrypt the the digest that was encrypted using your private key. So if the digest matches the decrypted digest, then they have established, whoever signed the document, whoever generated the signature, had access to your private key, and that usually implies that you basically assigned the document. So that's how digital signatures work. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So that is based on the assumption that only you can access that particular SMS message from whatever you're trying to sign into. So it does have certain flaws. I mean, there are certain ways to exploit that particular scheme. If somebody was to break into, now I'm not really sure how SMS works, whether it uses end-to-end encryption. I don't think it does. Okay, so if SMS is not based on end-to-end encryption, that means your mobile service provider, like T-Mobile or Verizon and whatnot, actually can read all the text that you receive and send. If that was the case, then somebody could have utilized the same code and sign in as you. Well, at least they will meet the second factor. The first factor, you'll still need to have your username and password. So it does make it safer because you need both of those. Using the digital certificate to sign in, people can be watching your network traffic, completely, and it will still work. So it does make a slight difference between this and the SMS-based two-factor authentication. Because this one is crypto-based, the other one was based on the assumption that only you can receive the SMS text message. Yes, that is correct. You can put it on your thumb drive. Yeah. That is correct. That is correct. Losing a key in a crypto type of situation, sometimes can be very, very bad. In this case, they can just regenerate a certificate later on. They just have to, you just have to kind of do it, in person, or they have to have another way to, to know who you are. You mean, can you have other users in Windows? Yes, you can. Yep. Yes, you can. Because you can choose which one you want to use to sign in. So you can have multiple certificates, each one to represent a different user ID, on the system. So that is entirely possible. In fact, Firefox, all browsers can maintain a list of certificates that are specific to you, and there can be multiple of those certificates. It is not required. When a digital certificate is used for authentication, it is usually implied that your password is no longer used. Now, whether your Windows system, your actual laptop computer, or your mobile device has a password to lock it down, that's a separate question. It is not related to whether we are using digital certificates or not. I don't think it's too much. If you want to get a personal signed certificate, we can quickly look it up. So we'll look for personal digital certificate. And DigitCert was one of the providers. I think we looked that up last time. So there you can go for basic SSL, click, and okay, it's working out the price, I suppose. Oh, okay, it's asking me how I want to do the multi-year plan. Okay. Oh, there we go. So it's 200 and something. We'll call it $20 a month. Nope, I take it back. A 1 year is $240 a year. So it's basically it's $20 a month, right? Yeah, $20 a month. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, if you're doing this for work, one of two things usually happens. One is whoever you're working for, franchise tax board, is going to generate its own self-signed certificates. which is perfectly okay in this case because if you cannot trust franchise tax board, then we have a problem. So you can use a self-signed certificate in that case, or franchise tax board as your employer is going to basically have a deal with one of the certificate authorities, and they would just handle the finance, the cost of the certificate itself. So for work situation, I can only assume that your employer will take care of that. Now, if you want to do this, for your own purpose, then you're going to have to shell out that money to, buy the signed certificate. You can always have self-signed certificates, but they don't go very far because the whole idea of having a certificate authority is somebody else can verify your identity before they give you that certificate. So there's that. All right. Any other questions? All right. So if there are no other questions, we move on to Kerberos. Okay. Haha. Well, I believe this is the three-headed dog. Yeah, I think so. I think that's the three-headed dog in mythology. Okay, let me do a quick search for that. Yep, that's the three-headed dog. And it is also a computer authentication method, a protocol. It's really kind of complicated. Okay, I did include a link to Wikipedia, and the exchange is a little bit involved to explain. So that's kind of the exchange of using Kerberos. So let's not get into this level of detail at this point, and instead I'll describe why it exists to begin with. All right. And this I can relate to because I have used Linux for a long time, both in university and also on my own. So it is not unusual, okay, that a computer lab at a university might have hundreds of computers, okay, hundreds of desktop computers. They're all running Linux, and you want your students to be able to sign in to one of those and establish an account, but you also want you don't want the students to have to set up a password on every single one of those 300 computers, so that the student can walk up to any computer that's available and then start to do the homework. That would not be reasonable. And instead, you want to establish just one single sign-in identity in the entire system. The student can walk up to any computer, right? Type in the username, type in the password, and be able to sign in and authenticate and just be done with it. And that's basically what Kerberos is for. Okay, it's for fixing the problem of every Linux, Unix system has its own, I would call it a database, but it's not actually a database, it's just a plain text file of maintaining, who the users are on that system and what their passwords are. Not exactly, but we'll call it that. Okay, we'll simplify and call it that. So it's basically for a single sign-in system for Unix, Linux type of systems. So this one does not originate from ZOS. It is from the other side of ZOS. So RackF can utilize Kerberos. So Kerberos is interesting because it doesn't just let people sign in, and use what is the equivalence of TSO. In Unix, we call that the CLI or the shell. So it's not just being able to access the shell or TSO. It also relates to services. In other words, a Kerberos aware database can also utilize Kerberos to establish the identity of a user who's requesting service. So it's actually a little bit more than just single sign-in so that we can execute commands on the command line interface. It in many ways it resembles what RackF is doing with ZOS. So the funny name is Kerberos. I'm pretty sure there's a history of why it is called Kerberos. I believe it has to do with it's a three-way system. So there are two servers related to Kerberos itself, and then one additional server that is actually offering the service that people want to access. So it's a three-headed system, and hence the name Kerberos. I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I think that's why it was called. It was coined the name Kerberos from MIT. So this has come from MIT. So this is a backend, that's probably coming from the Unix systems services of ZOS, because this has always been a Unix type of thing. It's not a System 360 kind of thing. So that's Kerberos. And there's also Pass Ticket. This one, I tried to do some research on it, and I couldn't quite find it. The only thing I was able to find was, Pass Ticket is a one-time password. And one-time passwords are very interesting too, because once you use it, it's invalidated. So what the system keeps track of, what one-time password it has generated. So once you use, one of those one-time passwords, it remembers, that one has been used and you cannot use it again. So it does provide a certain level of security, because somebody can be watching me type the one-time password into the system. They can write it down. They can take a picture of that. Is useless at that point. Once I press the enter key and actually use it to sign in, that one is useless from here on. So one-time passwords are interesting. And later on we'll talk about another kind of one-time password, and that's also quite interesting. I'm not sure whether you guys have started to use it or not, but it seems to be pretty convenient to me. Alright, so we are moving on to section 1.2, which is access control. Now I made this very simple. You might want to check out the footnotes. Okay, so there are quite a few footnotes related to access control. So RackF does not just do user authentication. It does not just establish that you are who you claim who you are. Okay. It also, once you sign in, RackF is also responsible to make sure that you only access the files or the data sets in a way that you are allowed to access. It's not just data sets either. It also relates to other services like CISC, CICS. It also includes DB2. So all the other subsystems on ZOS can also utilize RackF to establish your identity. Who is trying to gain access to the database. It can basically use your RackF for that purpose. So as far as data sets are concerned, the access can be classified into one of the following. The first one is pretty easy to understand, none, which means you do not have access to a particular data set. The next one is read, which is basically read only. You cannot modify, you cannot change it. And then we have update. So update and alter are two different things. If I remember correctly, you can look up the footnote here. Footnote number 7, would tell you more details, to differentiate between these. I believe update means you can change the dataset, but you cannot remove it, you cannot scratch it, you cannot delete it, you cannot move it somewhere else. But alter can. So one of these two can, delete the dataset, the other one cannot. Control, I think, has to do with not being able to read, but you can move the dataset. You can also delete the dataset. You can also scratch the dataset. Execute means you cannot read it, which means you cannot copy it. You can execute it. So that only applies to things that are executable. So let me just go ahead and look up footnote number 7, because I want to show you what that looks like. There we go. Alright, so here we go. Read is easy, none is easy. So here's update. update sets allow users to read from, copy from, and write to the dataset. It does not, however, authorize a user to delete, rename, move, or scratch the dataset. Alter, on the other hand, allows users to read, update, delete, rename, move, or scratch the dataset. So update is kind of more restrictive, and then alter is allows more actions to be performed. I don't think so. I think scratch means not only do you delete the dataset, you also basically you wipe the storage, so that there's nothing left of the dataset. We can look that up. Okay. Okay, that doesn't help. Got to add IBM to it. Okay. Yeah. Yep. I'll give you an analogy. It would be it's yeah, this will work. So think about, you're writing a book. Okay, you're writing a book with chapters, sections, and whatnot. So there's a table of contents. And the same thing is true for a volume as well. We call it the VTOC, right? So when you delete something, okay, it's not actually taking out the pages. Delete simply means you're erasing that entry from the table of contents. And then in the table of contents, okay, you just have one entry removed, and all the page numbers for all the other sections remain the same. So that means the pages of the section that you quote unquote deleted, they are still there in the book. You just lost the link directly to those pages from the table of contents. In other words, if somebody were to spend the time to read the book from cover to cover, that person will still be able to read the deleted chapters. Is that okay? That's what delete does. You're simply removing the link from the catalog when you're deleting something. So what scratch is actually going into those pages, tear those pages out and then send those pages, to a shredder. Does that work? Does that analogy work? Yeah. Or if you think about those spy movies, they're redited. The entire page is painted black, basically. So you can't see the content anymore, see the original content anymore. Actually, in this case, it's more like whiting out an entire page. So the page is now available for new content, but the old content cannot be read anymore. It's gone. So it's a very important step. And even if you were to quote unquote physically erase content, there are agencies with tools that can retrieve content even though it is quote unquote wiped magnetically. So the idea is when you think about a track on a DASD. Okay, so a track on the DASD is basically a magnetic medium rotating with a disk head on top, using a magnetic field to change the polarization of the media. Okay, that's how you record something. But that track has a certain width to it. Okay, and every time you get to a track, the disk head is going to be off by just a little bit. Okay, so sometimes it's a little bit off like this. Okay, if you look at the the webcam. So let's say this is the width of the original track. Okay, this is where it wrote the original content. The next time when you position the head, it can be about here, it can be about here. Okay, it's off by just a little bit. So for regular operation, for reading and writing, not a problem. Okay, so when you're erasing or when you're scratching, using IBM's term, when you're scratching the content of a track, let's say the original data is recorded here. When you're scratching it, which means you're overwriting the track with zeros or random data or whatever, if it's off by just a little bit like this, then you have this much area that still had the original content. And there are people, okay, especially with the government, who has the capability of positioning the head or have some other equipment to read just that portion. So they would still be able to retrieve the original data even though you quote unquote scratched the medium. Yeah. So, and that's why, when commercially, when people, in outside of IBM terminology, this is called wiping. Okay, when you wipe a hard drive, you're basically overwriting all the tracks, all the cylinders with new data. Okay, so if you overwrite the track with just zeros, then it's very easy to retrieve the portion that's just a little bit off, that still had the original content. If the rest are predictable, then whatever is left is actually relatively easy to read. So and that's why when people wipe hard drives, they wipe it with random data. So that way it's really hard to distinguish what is the data in the leftover portion that was not properly erased and what is actually in the data that is intentionally erased. So that's makes it a lot harder to find it. And some people who are paranoid about this sort of thing will random wipe a hard drive like multiple times just to be sure that the content is no longer retrievable. Yeah, I know it's interesting, and it sounds kind of like extreme, but when you work for the government, depending on which agency you work for, and depending on the sensitivity of the data, this stuff may actually be relevant. So you can talk to other people about this too. Just to see in practice what they actually do when they scratch data. IBM knows about this stuff too, and they have hardware crypto engine. And I would not be surprised when IBM, quote unquote, scratches the medium, is actually using what I just said. It wipes it multiple times using random data. Um, it's just not specified. When I looked up the usual manual, it just says it's scratched. It doesn't say, how it is scratched. So just kind of interesting stuff. And then we move on to logging and reporting. So RackF has logging and reporting capabilities, and here's a footnote number 8 that links to it. So it allows an operator to perform real-time monitoring, and this is why on most systems there's always somebody actually on duty, because in case the system detects anything, this person will be notified in real time right away, and that person can basically look at the monitor and be able to identify, okay, who signed in, did what, to what, okay, at what time. Should I alert, someone else, or is this something that is just, yeah, we know that person is supposed to do that. So there's a real-time monitoring capability, but it also has a log. So the log is good for after the fact analysis. Okay, something happened, and we're going to go back to the log last night. We're going to go back to the log before last night, and we'll go back as far as we possibly can to find out what happened. Okay, somebody, maybe some data got disclosed. Okay, some classified data got disclosed. So we need to go back and find out, okay, who could have done that. So that's what the log is good for. So there we go. So now we're done with RackF. So RackF is kind of a core component to ZOS. It has to be there in order for ZOS to function properly. The second one, Multifactor Authentication, MFA, is an add-on, and it is not essential, but I think most modern systems are going to have it. Simply because password protection, even if you can specify a passphrase which is longer than 8 characters, the whole idea of using password is really not secure. And that really has to do with the fact that we cannot, as humans, we cannot keep track of a whole bunch of passwords that are randomly generated. So when we create a new password, it's going to be based on names, street names, numbers that we're familiar with, and so on. So there are really only so many combinations that we can manually or mentally we can track. Okay, and beyond that, you'll start to have to write down the password on a piece of paper, which is actually surprisingly not that much of a security risk if you think about it. So I got to mention this too. Because most people think the first time I encountered this was at Fry's, when Fry's was still around. They were selling these little notebooks about yay big, and you can write down your sign-ins to different URLs. It's just kind of lined up, and you can on one side you can write down what it's for, and then on the other side you can write down what the password is. And at the time I thought, this is so dumb, because if somebody picked up this little booklet, they would have access to everything. And then I encountered numerous apps on mobile devices to keep track of passwords. Well, guess which one is dumber? The apps are actually worse, way worse. Okay. And the reason why the apps are way worse is because your mobile device is usually, okay, for very few people, they might turn off everything and put the whole cell phone inside a aluminum foil lined bag, okay? But most of us are online 24/7, right? So that makes it less secure, because it is constantly having network connections. Okay, and then the second question is, do you really know who wrote the app? Okay, because that person potentially has access to all the passwords along with what they're for. So if that author decides to go rogue, okay, they can build into the app the ability to upload the passwords, to quote-unquote mothership. That would not be good. So when you think about it this way, okay, an app to keep track, as they call these keychains. So an app on your mobile device to keep track of passwords is actually a worse idea compared to using a a little physical booklet to keep track of the passwords. I want to see what you guys think of this, if you guys want to participate in the discussion. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Okay. I never let browsers save my password for a different reason. Because if the system saves my password, I cannot remember those passwords when I need to sign in from a different system. So I always key in the passwords. Now, even if you key in the passwords, I mean, this is kind of a little bit beyond what we are talking about here. When you're at work, okay, does anyone know what a keylogger is? It can be a program, but it can also be a device. Yeah, it doesn't have, it's really small. Okay, it looks like a USB dongle, the tiny little USB dongle. So it plugs into the back of your computer, and then the other side plugs into the keyboard. So its only job is to record every single key press. So you might say, but in the entire day, I do all kinds of work on my computer, and there will be so many keystrokes, and how can they possibly know which one is a password and which one is not? Well, they can record the time, they can record a lot of extra information to help narrow down which one is a password. And besides, your password, if you do it correctly, is going to look different from regular text that you type. So keylogger, is a big potential security risk if somebody has physical access to the computers. And if you think about it, okay, at your office, how many people have access to your computer in the office? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Right. That won't If you remote in, it won't be a problem. The keylogger only works if you're typing on the actual physical keyboard. Yeah. Yeah, but your IT could set up, a system where they can monitor everything. They can monitor your entire screen. They can see what you are seeing. They can also potentially monitor your keyboard activity as well. So, but that's your IT department, okay? So if your IT department goes rogue, we have a problem. It goes way beyond keyloggers, okay? We have a serious problem. Yep. So that's a whole separate thing. But if somebody, without COVID-19, okay, when we do work in the office, and somebody walk in, because that person is an acquaintance of somebody else, they see a cubicle is empty. They go into the cubicle and go like, I'm just gonna go into the empty cubicle to take a break, okay? While waiting for somebody else to go out for lunch, okay? They can use that as an excuse, okay? They go to the back of the computer, they locate which USB plug plugs into the keyboard, put that thing in, and they just need to find a way to come back and retrieve the keylogger at a later point. Okay, then they would be able to, see all the keyboard keystrokes, at least up to the capacity of the keylogger. And these days, capacity is not an issue because flash drives, tiny little flash drives have what, gigabytes of storage. And if you think about keystrokes, when do you think you're gonna have billions of keystrokes? Exactly, right? I mean, so that can be a problem. Um, it has to be a case where the keyboard uses a USB cable to connect to the computer. So if you use an external keyboard, even if it's a laptop computer, it can still happen. But in those cases, it will be pretty obvious because your laptop computer typically is within visual range, so you can see that little dongle thing that's sticking out of the USB port of your computer. You go like, what is that? But if your desktop computer, most people do not want their desktop computer to be on the desk, right? The whole idea of desktop is a misnomer. We want our desktop computer to be out of the way, right? And then the back ports, okay? When was the last time you checked what was plugged into your office computer in the back? That's exactly my point. That's exact. Mm-hmm. That's better. Yep. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Well, that's actually what. Well, the docking station still has ports, right? It still has USB ports to hook up to an external keyboard. So anytime you have an external keyboard that hooks up to a USB port, that can potentially happen. Now, guess what? There's one concept that we have discussed up to this point that can, well, kind of, it can alleviate the issue. Okay, it doesn't eliminate, but it does make it not as bad. It's OTP, one-time passwords. So if you use one-time passwords, to sign in, or two-factor authentication, both will basically limit what kind of damage can be done when somebody does install a keylogger. Because a one-time password is only useful one time, so they can see the password all they want. Is once you press the enter key, that password is no longer useful. So that's one. And then two-factor authentication is kind of the same way. They can grab your password, but if two-factor authentication is in place, they will still have access. They will still need access to your cell phone in order to get the second factor. So those things definitely help. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So if you just plug in something, it won't. The system won't let you access it. Keylogger. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. So as far as I know, okay, which may not be the case anymore, but I believe wireless mice and wireless keyboards do not use any encryption, and if they do, it is not any type of heavy-duty encryption. So it will be a very light-duty encryption that's easy to crack. So that's the other thing. If you use the wireless mouse is not so much of a problem because they can only see how you're moving the cursor, your mouse cursor. But a wireless keyboard can potentially be broadcasting your keystrokes because now it's not just the keylogger being able to capture it. It's because it's wireless. It's using radio frequency. So if somebody has a listening device, as basically a snooping device, they can potentially intercept the signal and be able to know what you're typing. So I'm just gonna look it up because of curiosity. I'm just gonna look up right here, and we'll look for wireless keyboard encryption. There we go. There we go. Your wireless keyboard isn't safe. First link. And apparently there are secure encrypted wireless keyboards. And the screen looks vaguely familiar, doesn't it? It does look like a 3270 session. All right. It's like it's like in Fast and Furious, they at least someone knows how to drive a stick shift. Not all. All right, next concept is in-band and versus out-of-band. These terms are actually new to me. That's something I looked up. In-band refers to authentication that is performed inside a secure intranet, whereas out-of-band is the other way. It's coming from outside, so the authentication is coming from outside of a secure intranet. So the first point I want to make, this is from watching a presentation, of somebody who was talking about IBM ZOS, RackF type of authentication, was most of the attack of a mainframe computer came from inside, not from outside. It's not really surprising, this is what I wrote here in this particular paragraph. I think that has to do with mainframe shops are very individual, very specialized. Because last time I went to an IBM workshop when we were writing up a document, one person was from the DMV, and then the other person I believe was coming from EDD. And in the conversation, the two shops were set up so differently that if one employee was to go work for the other employee, it would probably take weeks, if not months, to get used to how the other shop get things done. So that means hacking into a mainframe system when somebody has absolutely no knowledge of the shop itself, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to just to get around, find out how things are set up, and so on and so forth. And I think that partially contribute to the statistics of why most of the break-in attempts are from within and not from outside, because it's just much harder compared to non-mainframe systems, because Unix systems are fairly standardized. You can really kind of write a suite of scripts, okay, to check out the system, find out the weak points of the in terms of security and so on and so forth. But from what I have seen, with IBM mainframe shops, they are so individually set up that it's just hard to have one type of attack that works on all different shops. So that being said, IBM MFA does differentiate between out-of-band authentication from in-band authentication, and there are two footnotes here. Each one is for out-of-band, and then there are two for in-band authentication. Well, one for in-band authentication and another one for how to differentiate between the two. So from out-of-band authentication, you also need to access a website. So the website is the one that will give you a two-factor authentication challenge. So you have to get a key. Now that key can be coming from a token, coming from one of those RSA key device, that shows a number, depending on the time it changes. And then for in-band authentication, you don't need to go to a website to do it. You just go straight into the TSO sign in, and then you just sign in. You can still use a token for that purpose, but you won't need to go to the website to for the first quote-unquote first gate before you can get into the second gate. So this part is interesting. It's new to me. So section 2.2 is interesting because you can look this up. I mean, this is an actual thing. It's called a touch token. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to ask, does any one of you use a touch token to sign into a mainframe? No, this is specific for IBM with iOS devices. Are you talking about an RSA token? Like, okay. Yeah, it's not this. Now, with this type of token, do you actually have to press a key? I thought it just automatically updates the number. Okay. Okay. Does it automatically update the number based on time? Like if you just let it sit around for a while, does it update the number automatically? Okay. Okay, to get the next number. Okay, so all of those are it's basically a combination between an OTP, a one-time password, and also just the usual second factor authentication. If I understand correctly, these devices do not have any authentication itself. In other words, anyone can, if somebody can physically get to your token, they could press that key too, right? There's nothing you need to sign in on the device. In addition, okay. Okay, gotcha. So with the touch token, you can kind of imagine, having your, if you have an iPhone or any iOS device, that becomes your token generator. But because on an iOS device, they can set it up to require fingerprint authentication. So that means it is just one step, at least one step more secure compared to the usual the keychain token, because you have to be able to get into your iPhone first before you can get to the app that replaces the token machine. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Does it work in different types of lighting conditions? Okay, so you can still punch in the password, if the facial recognition doesn't work. Now right, yeah. Same with my Android device. So did you guys set up your iPhone for work purposes so that your IT people can actually enforce certain types of security policies on your iPhone? Oh, okay. Well, even if it is personal, if you set it up for Exchange, if you hook up to an Exchange server that is for work purposes, the Exchange app itself, can talk to the Android system in my case, and it basically would notify me and say the IT people in charge of Exchange can remotely set up policies on my phone to require certain types of authentication. That is actually true. In other words, I cannot make my cell phone so that it does not require authentication to get to the screen. It needs to have at least, if I remember correctly, a number-based PIN. I can use a PIN, I can use fingerprint, or I can use just drawing a figure on the screen, but it will not let me go without any type of authentication, and that's remotely required by just because I sign up Exchange with my employer. So I would imagine, if someone was to set up touch token, it would also require the same thing. It would require a certain level of authentication on the mobile device itself before the app would even function. All right. Does anyone want to? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is why some people do not want to use a personal phone. Instead, they would much rather to even have a separate phone for that. Yeah, you can probably check. It would have told you about that. It would have warned you when you installed the app. It would have warned you and let you know that, by installing this app, by using this app, you are allowing remote policy enforcement on your mobile device. So you can probably just look it up and find out whether that's true or not. At least for Citrus, but I know for Exchange that is true already for sure. All right, so we're moving on to encryption. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, sure. So we'll be back at 45. All right. Well, I'm still here, so if you guys want to talk about any specific topic. Sierra College? I did not know. I was drowning in grading in the past week. I got one class of 60 students, and I did not set up the test in a way that's easy to grade. Everything is open-ended. So I timed myself. It would take me between 5 to 8 minutes to grade one exam. So you multiply that by 60, and that's the number of minutes that I need to grade it. Well, it's just, some stuff is unexpected. And it's an unexpected times 3, right? Because, originally Jerome, and then we have Sabir the first time, and then we have Sabir the second time. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. 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 Hmm. Well, does that identify the computer or does it identify the user? But once you get to the computer, don't you still need to authenticate on that virtual computer as you? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that means he would not have been able to sign in as you, even though he was able to get to the virtual machine that you normally use. Yeah. Okay. That kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Hmm. Right. Yeah. VPN is also interesting in the context of what we are talking about because VPN basically makes everything in band instead of out of band. Because when you sign in, because as long as you can sign into VPN, after you sign into VPN, all the traffic through VPN is considered in band traffic. So that's why you don't have to deal with out of band authentication anymore, because you got that one extra layer of networking security, VPN, to basically make it so that it would appear that you are actually at work using their network. And that is also why if VPN is used on a personal computer, they really have to lock down that personal computer because if a hacker gets onto that computer, that person would be able to access through the VPN as well. And that's partially explained why Sabir said, when he was using his own laptop computer, the laptop computer that EDD issued to him, he was able to access his at work computer using VPN, but he was not able to access Google Doc. Remember, that's why, because Google Doc potentially can be a place where data can be leaked onto. I mean, that's just easy to leak stuff onto Google Drive and Google Doc. So I think that's what happened, with his EDD computer. And I'm guessing everybody's back at 45. Yeah, it's 48 right now. So this is really kind of interesting because it relates to what we talked about last week. Just about 5 days ago, we were talking about ransomware, and sure enough, just happened. Yeah, right there. I mean, I'm screen sharing. So this is on. It was reported on the 20th of May, 4 days ago. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Los Rios is hustling to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm just gonna read this a little bit if you guys don't mind. I want to find out what they encrypted. What did the hacker got into. Uh, so so it's the right. But what did they encrypt? That is so essential to the college. If they just got to the website, it's not a big deal. I mean, that just loses your front end. That means some students who want to find some services may have problems. So I think it's something more core to the operation of the college got encrypted. They didn't quite say exactly what got encrypted, but to cripple the operation of a college, it has to be something like Canvas or the email system. That sort of stuff can be very crippling. But if it's really just the front end of the website, it's like pff, whatever. And that typically is backed up too. So whatever whatever the ransomware was encrypting, was encrypted by ransomware. They obviously did not back it up either. Which will bring to uh that's a good question. Let me look. Oh, so they paid 5 million, but they lost 90 million of sales. Okay, that could be true. That really is the big deal, right? That's really driving the decision of these organizations to actually pay the ransom because if they don't, they're going to lose more money. Yeah. That depends on what the ransomware is hitting. Hmm. Hmm. Oh. Hmm. Yep. Yep. Hmm. Yep. Just because he thinks like one doesn't make him one. Yep. Yeah, social engineering is very interesting. The FBI does that to criminals on Facebook. So the FBI would have their employees to pretend to be I would just say attractive people, to try to approach to who they already know, who they suspect are criminals. So they would start to befriend those individuals on Facebook, and those individuals would actually fall prey to these social engineering approaches. And a lot of times, they would just spill their guts, and they would just go. They would be so proud of what they have done, and then the FBI is just like, "Oh, this is good stuff. Thank you for letting me know." Hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Okay, I'm going to show you guys one thing that's related to what we talked about. And it is still related to mainframe computers because a lot of mainframe computers now are forward facing on the web. And it also relates to the discussion of RESTful API. Remember RESTful API? That's how computers or servers or systems talk to each other, so that Facebook can talk to Instagram and they can talk to blah 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 blah, so they can all collaborate to figure out what you like. Scary stuff. Okay, but this is what I want to show you. I'm gonna go to a place called CISC331.org. Okay, this is basically a place where you can get a signed certificate, but it is not a certificate authority itself. Okay, so this is really just for personal stuff where you don't need to be signed by a real certificate authority. So when you see a sign like this, the lock has a little slash across it, that means it is not secure. So right now it's going through plain text HTTP, so that means whatever your ISP is, they get to see where you're going, they get to see what document is coming back to your computer, and so on and so forth. So the first thing you want to do is to go to HTTP right here, because that's secure HTTP using SSL, as a secure sockets layer. That's the name of SSL for encryption. So watch this. Watch this. Press the enter key. Ta-da! So it says right here, potential security risk ahead. So now the question is, why is it giving you this warning? Now, if you're trying to go to Wells Fargo Bank and you get this message, stop right away. Okay, do not proceed any further. Because what this means is the certificate coming back from CACert.org is not signed by a certificate authority. That's basically what it means. Now, in this case, I know what this website is, and I know they don't have a certificate that is signed by a certificate authority, so it's not super big as a deal. Okay, they don't have. I'm not going to give them any financial information, any personal information, no password, nothing. Okay, so in this case, it's you can go ahead. But if you're trying to access your bank, like wellsfargobank.com, or American Express and so on, and by the way, both of those use IBM mainframes as their data processing mechanism. So that's kind of interesting. So in this case, you can look up the little sign here and go to connection not secure. Oh, okay. So this is still not using HTTPS yet. If I continue, then it will go there. So let's see. View certificate. All right. And it would say CA Cert Signing Authority, and it's signed by CACert.org itself, which is not considered a certificate authority, and that's why the warning got generated. So kind of interesting stuff relating to what you guys were just talking about. All right, so now we're getting to encryption. So first of all, we got into RackF. RackF is the kind of integral part of ZOS that does authentication, but kind of rudimentary, simple type of authentication. It can utilize other means, but it doesn't do multi-factor, and that's what MFA is about. Okay, multi-factor authentication. So now we get into encryption, which is another way of securing data, on a system. So the first part I want to talk about, that kind of makes IBM mainframe computers different from other types of servers, is it has hardware for encryption purposes. I actually looked this up, and it's really kind of interesting too. So it has got dedicated controllers for encryption purposes. So that is, it does two things. Okay, the first thing is it offloads encryption processing so that the main processors can do actual data processing instead of encryption and decryption. That's the first thing. The second one is even more interesting, because with dedicated hardware to do encryption, that means the encryption keys do not need to be accessible by the users anymore once they are set up, because now each encryption key pair can be identified by a label. So you just have to tell the processor, the dedicated encryption processor, you can just say, oh, here's the stream of bytes. I want you to use the encryption key of this label to do the decryption. So you're just specifying which key or which certificate to use, but you're not actually providing the actual certificate. And that makes it more secure, because your certificate is not actually quote unquote stored as a data set anymore. It is actually located inside the subprocessor for encryption. So that's kind of interesting, because it does improve security in this case. All right, so moving on. All right, so the first question is, why do you want to encrypt a data set? Okay, that's the first question. Or I can also ask, when do you typically encrypt a data set? All right, so that's a very good answer. Okay, when a data set has sensitive information, you want to encrypt it. Now, when you encrypt it, you basically want to make sure that other people cannot, non-authorized people do not have access to the data. So when you are processing a data set, okay, so let's just say that there are certain types of data sets that you have to process on a daily basis. The question is, would you encrypt those data sets? Okay, and why not? All right. So I'll ask you this question, okay? Yes, but remember, a lot of times, data theft is not done by an outsider. It's done by someone who's internal to the organization. In other words, mm-hmm. So, okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If it's meant for everyone, and everybody is supposed to have read access to the data set, obviously encryption is not needed. But on the other hand, if it does contain sensitive data, but it only needs to be processed, like for an hour or so each day, what about the other 23 hours? Mm-hmm. Mhm. 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 So RackF is limiting who has what kind of access to the data set. Go ahead, Lupe. So there are two levels of security here. The first one is, can someone have access to the data set? And the second one is, if they do get to the data set, can they read the content of the data set? So traditionally, encryption is only needed when you are backing up data sets onto a tape, and then you are trying to do an offsite backup, which is super important these days because of ransomware. Because with ransomware, you want offline backup, because anything that is online and a hacker can potentially get to your online backup and also encrypt that, which also that actually happened to someone whom I know. The hacker went around the entire system, went through all the FTP sites that they send their backup to, and they encrypted everything. So you want off-site, offline backup to deal with ransomware, because now all they can do is touch everything that is online. If you have your tape backup that's stored inside a vault of some kind, they won't have access to it. Okay, so you can always use that to restore the system. You might be off by a day, a week, or something, but you won't be completely empty-handed. So for offsite backup like that, you definitely want to do encryption, because whoever has physical access to the tape on its way to the vault, okay, can potentially read the content of the tape. Okay, on a security truck, okay, you can kind of think about. I know this sounds a little extreme, but if you think about it, in the security in a how do you call those names? Um, how do you call those trucks? To move, like money and armored vehicles, exactly. So you can kind of imagine inside one of those things, they have a tape drive. So when you're trying to send your tape for offsite backup, whoever is driving that truck potentially has physical access to the tape. So you want to do encryption to make sure that once the tape is um, off of the system, it is already encrypted. You can gain physical access to the zeros and ones, but you won't be able to access the information. That doesn't make sense. Okay. But there are also situations that I can kind of imagine where you only need to process sensitive data maybe once a day for about an hour. So in those cases, you don't really need to keep the data in plain text, in clear text, the rest of the day, because that's really just unnecessary exposure that doesn't need to be there. Does that kind of make sense? Maybe. So in those situations, now this is something that I just wrote. Okay, the last three paragraphs, you guys can toss it away if you don't want to read it. That's fine, but it's basically a mechanism by which it involves using two systems. And it basically makes it impossible for someone to steal data if they can only break into one of the two systems. So one system that is actually storing the data set have only has access to the data set that is encrypted using the key of the other system. The other system that is actually doing the processing, does not store the data set. It would basically get the data set from the first system, decrypt it, process it, re-encrypt it, and then send it back to the first system. So this way, if a hacker goes into the first system, they can have access to the data set itself, but it won't be the same system that has the private key to decipher the content. If they get into the other system, they won't have the file or the data set to begin with, because the data set is actually stored in the in the opposite system. So they will need to hack into both systems in order to get to the content of the file of the data set. But you can ignore that, because that's just me doing some mental exercise, mental push up to go like, what if I have a situation like this? So that's just for that purpose. But this stuff here, right above that, is actually relevant, because this is the JCL statement that you use to decrypt the content of an encrypted dataset, and then you have to use a RSA control statement to specify the label of the key corresponding to how you want to decipher or decrypt the dataset. So these are kind of actually relevant to what you might encounter. Do you guys actually encounter encrypted dataset at work? No? Okay. Well, I don't know how sensitive the data is. I would imagine, with the franchise tax board, the data or the information stored on the mainframe computers are pretty sensitive. The DMV definitely is going to be sensitive, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in that case, so when you mention the word file, I'm gonna guess that actually means dataset. Yeah. So if the dataset is encrypted, this is the statement to use to it's part of a DD statement, but this is how you can specify how to decrypt an encrypted dataset. So you can this is it's kind of relevant to what you just said, Jennifer. And then depending on the system, some IBM systems have actual hardware, crypto hardware. So in those systems, you're not going to use the RSA control statement to specify the key. You can use a password statement to specify the password to unlock the file. Because the keys, the certificates sometimes can be password protected too. So that's one way to kind of unlock a certificate to use its content. All right, so that's pretty much all that I have prepared. I didn't really read all the paragraphs here, but I think essentially I got most of the content to do it. Most of the content that I need to talk about when it comes to encryption. I used to do this kind of stuff, when I maintained my own servers. So whenever I need to back up something, the backup itself is encrypted coming out of the server. So it's not plain text out of the server and then encrypted, somewhere else. And that has to do with in Unix and Linux systems. There's a concept called a pipe, which allows the output of one program to be the input of another program. So you can basically chain commands, together. So that way, the actual plain text file is never really stored on any permanent storage. So you don't have to worry about, I might have left behind some sensitive data on the DAS-D, and if somebody gained access to the DAS-D, they might be able to get to that content. Using a pipe concept, that is never an issue. I cannot find out on an IBM on ZOS whether that is possible or not. The only two things I found out was in a DD statement, you can specify sysout and you can specify sysin, but I was not able to find out whether the sysout of one job can serve as the sysin of another job, but it is not stored on a DASD. I believe it always has to be stored. Is that correct? Does anyone know? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But is it actually stored in a DASD, or do you think both jobs are actually running at the same time, and it's ZOS is really taking directly what is coming out of one program to feed it to the second program, or does it let the first program finish entirely, store the entire output of the first program, and then specify that as the input of the second program? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. But in that case, is the temporary data set actually stored? Okay, but mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking this up right now. So if it's a temporary dataset, if you specify a storage class, or if an installation written automatic class selection routine selects a storage class for the temporary dataset. But it still doesn't say whether it's actually stored on the DAS-D or not, because the whole idea is I may not want to store that on the DAS-D, so I don't want it to have any presence whatsoever on a storage device. It's probably not a big concern for most people, but I'm just kind of curious, is there a way to avoid, actually, doing this? So this way you can go from an encrypted dataset as input, do all the processing, and then the only thing that's going to come out of the job is an encrypted dataset. So there's nothing in plain text in between whatsoever. That's basically what I was trying to get to. All right. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense from the perspective of a batch processing perspective. In Unix, that's possible. I know that one. But it's set up in an entirely different type of using a different set of premises, so it's different. So I do have one thing I want to mention is what happens when you lose your key when something is encrypted. No, you lose the content. Whatever you locked up using that key is forever lost. So this is important, okay? This is important because this means if anyone is using encryption, um, because this is not the same as losing your certificate, okay? If you're trying to sign in using a certificate and somehow you lost your certificate, they can just reissue another certificate, right? As long as they can establish your identity and know that, okay, I know Jennifer is the actual Jennifer. Okay, here's your new certificate, and you can use it to sign in. Not a problem. Encryption is a different thing. So if you encrypt the offsite backup, like from 3 years ago, and then in that period of time, everybody has moved on, and the new people coming in cannot find the certificate or the key that was used to encrypt that particular data set on the tape backup, it's as good as gone. It really is. I have to say this because in most systems, including Windows NT, NTFS, and the NT file system, you can actually encrypt the entire partition. That's an option. Okay, so what that means is if somebody has physical access to your laptop computer, they can rip the hard drive or the solid state drive out of your computer, and they won't be able to read anything on it because the drive itself was encrypted. Okay, so it's a good thing. On the other hand, if you lose the password to the encryption, your hard drive is basically gone. There's no way to retrieve the content. Once you lose your password to that type of encryption. So I just want to bring it up because that's something that organizations need to take care of, is when they use encryption on offsite backups. And the whole idea of offsite backup is sometimes it might need to last a few years. I believe Tway said that the backup of her organization doesn't live very long, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of time that they back up stuff, and then after that they wipe the tape. Is that correct, Tway? Yeah. Oh, I'm talking about backing up, offsite backup. I think that was one point we talked about offsite backup, and you said, with your unit, they only maintain backup for a certain amount of time, and then after that they would scratch it. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, they're on site. Okay. Hmm. Right, right. So and you don't have so much capacity to back up too. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, so before I let you guys go, I do have to tell you one story. It's not an IBM mainframe story, but nonetheless, it does emphasize, it does relate to what we talked about today. So years ago, I was maintaining a server for a certain organization that I would not name, and I was just in charge of something that had basically no security concern whatsoever. Okay, so the content or the part of the system that I was maintaining was stuff that was of no consequence whatsoever. Okay, and so I was like, okay, I don't need to worry about anything. Then I was sharing administrator permissions with other people. So those other people were, they do have access to, and they are also responsible for other systems that contain much more sensitive data. Okay, so that doesn't seem to concern me, right? I mean, why would that concern me? Because they have access to my system, and my system itself never had access to anything that is considered sensitive. Okay, I could have published every single byte of that hard drive, and nobody would have cared. So why would I have an interesting story to tell? Well, this is why. Those people, they were also in charge of backing up the server that I was an administrator of. So they were also responsible to back up the content of that drive. Even though it's not important, they still want to back it up. Okay, that's not an issue. So the way they back up the content is they would mount a remote file system, so that the program to do all the backup is running on the server that I was in charge of, and then the content would now be backed up onto a file system that is remote to my system, so that the backup file is created on the other side. All right, so does everybody understand the setup at this point? That is correct. So that doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Besides, remember, every single byte on my system is of little consequence. Okay, there's nothing sensitive on my system whatsoever. Now, my system does have exposure to a lot of people, but remember, since there's nothing sensitive on my system, it's not a big deal. So as it turns out, the way they do the backup was to use a Unix or Linux command called mount. Okay, the so-called mount command is really just used so that you can bring in an external file system so that it looks like it is a part of your local system. That's basically what mount does on a Unix/Linux system. So they would mount the remote system, and then because now that it becomes a part of the local file system, it appears as if it is a local file system. So we can now just run a normal command, tar, which is TAR, stands for tape archive. So they would just kind of tar the entire file system and then back it up to the other system, and that's the end of it. So what I found was they would mount it, and then sometimes it would not unmount. So the remote file system would remain mounted on as if it is a part of the system that I'm in charge of, that has exposure to a lot of people. And then I also found that they back up other systems onto that remote file system, including the file system that has sensitive data. Are you guys getting the picture? I ended up on my system, I ended up having access to the backup of other servers that had sensitive data. And now you would think, that's bad, but if all that data was encrypted, then I just have access to the file itself. I won't have access to the actual content. Well, that's when it comes in handy, because I wanted to emphasize the importance of encryption. They were not encrypted. So as a result, people on my system, if they know well enough how to navigate around the system, they would have been able to access a dump of a database that contained the social security, address, name of spouse, and a whole bunch of other things about employees of that organization. Oh, it is a big oops, okay? And the other thing was, I told the IT people about this in February. And comes October, nothing happened in between. Fortunately, the other users on my system were not experienced, type of people. They were kind of entry-level people who were just really trying to navigate and, just do their own things. They were having problems getting things done that they're supposed to do. Okay, so they were not hackers. They didn't have the expertise to navigate and look around. But if they had, they would have been able to locate those backup files that backed up the backup of other systems. They would have been able to access those and just grab the data dump out of it. And the data dump coming out of a database is in plain text. It's not even, there's no pretense whatsoever of the content. So that kind of tells you why encryption is important, because sometimes we make a mistake, and a dataset, in the case of a mainframe computer, a dataset is mistakenly accessible by people who are not supposed to be able to access it. So that can happen. So encryption adds that one extra layer of protection of, even if you have read access to the dataset, you still cannot figure out what the content is because the dataset is encrypted. So this is why I think it is important to keep things encrypted unless it is really needed on a 24/7 type of basis. If the data set is really only needed as a nightly job, decipher, decrypt it, get it processed, and then re-encrypt it so that the rest of the day, the other 23 hours, in case somebody set up the RackF access control incorrectly, you will still not be leaking the data out. The file, the dataset is readable, but the content is not readable. So I think that's just the last little bit of story I want to share with this class. And then tomorrow at 5:30, I'm gonna start. I will release the assessment. I'm not even gonna call that a final exam because you guys have a little more than 24 hours to finish it. I will be online tomorrow, but for the most part, I will be finishing up the grading and the reporting of the grading for my other classes. But you can still contact me by I was about to say Discord, but no, you can still contact me by Zoom. Just message me and I'll see what I can do to help you. So is that okay? Yeah, 5:30 p.m. because I need time to set it up. Oh, okay. Wednesday morning. Okay. Yeah. No, it's due on Wednesday anytime. So anytime before midnight of Thursday is okay. No, midnight is supposed to be the beginning of the following day. Yes. Yes. 11:59:59. Yes. So would that be sufficient time? Yeah, yeah. June 7th is the. I think so. Let me double check. Give me a second here. I just need to check on my Outlook. All right, CISC 332, right? Okay. Give me a second here. I'm just reading some email from my Exchange. Okay, so it says right here, it looks like CIS. I'm just quoting from the email. It looks like CISC 332 is currently on the schedule for July. And let me see what is the reply to that. Yeah, so 333. Okay, and then this is another message. Having 8-week class could take place any 8-week between June 7th to August 20th. No, wait. I'm just reading, back reading all the messages. Okay, so the last one that I got seemed to be suggesting that they're going to start the class on the 21st of June and ending the class on August 16th. So I don't think they're going to fit both CISC 332 and 333 in the summer. That's going to be pretty intense. Okay, so I do not know in that case. Because the dean said, it would be kinder not to compress the class to 4 weeks. It would be better to offer it as an 8-week class, and I think she was referring to 332. So 332, if I remember correctly, is, I can look it up too. I think it's also a 2-unit class like this one. So if you compress it to 4 weeks, that means you'll be meeting like what we are doing, but twice as frequently per week. And I think that's going to be very intense. I can ask to clarify. I can, by Wednesday I can probably get you an answer. Because, well, do you guys have a preference? Do you want it to be compressed? Because it's already compressed as it is. Huh? Sorry? That's because Mark had other obligations, so he would not be free to teach until close to the end of June. And because the dean said it will be kinder to offer as an 8-week class, so that's why I saw the schedule from June, end of June, June 23rd, I think, to August something, for the first class. Yeah, but do you guys have any preference? I mean, if you had a choice of, taking, the 2 classes at each one as a 4-week class versus taking both as 8-week classes but extending the time period all the way to, somewhere in the middle of the fall semester, do you have a preference, or do you want to get it done even though it's super? Okay, I understand. Okay. Yeah. I agree with Lupe. I do agree with Lupe. Mhm. Okay. No, it doesn't have to be. I can bridge so that you guys can talk to Mark, and if it's already determined, there might be not much that we can change. But I think it would be helpful for Mark to understand your situations, so that even if the schedule is already determined, he can basically teach in whatever way that can best accommodate all of you. Okay. Okay. I can show you. Give me a second here. I can bring up the curricula. Just give me a second. Hmm. Yep. At least next week off. Yep. Yeah, you have at least. All right. So you're looking at the learning objectives of CISC 332. So it goes from explaining the MVS function control block necessary to support a task in a multitasking environment. So it does talk about something that we have touched on. Trace the flow of an I/O operation. Identify control blocks that describe the current status of an I/O request. So that's going into lower level detail than what we covered in this class. Describe the functions of the ZOS, BCS, virtual, real, and auxiliary storage managers. Okay, so that's CISC 332. That seems like a lot of topic, to cover in 4 weeks. I think that's going to be really pressed for 4 weeks. Now, 333, if I remember correctly, at least one of you said that's actually pretty useful stuff because that's what you're supposed to be doing after your transition. So that's SMPE. Yeah, and this one does have a lot of very specific things that it needs to go over. Yep. Well, I will let Mark know so that he can decide whether he wants to kind of get in touch with all of you because he wants to plan the class to be useful to you as well. So we are not just saying, okay, these are the things on the syllabus because IBM said so, and we really want it to be useful to you. So let me contact Mark and see what he wants to do. Because if he says he wants to kind of get in touch with all of you to find out what would be the best way to organize the class, then he can go ahead and do that. So would that be okay? Okay, I will do that also. So so tomorrow at 5:30, I'm gonna open the assessment, and you have until 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday to turn it in. So I hope that gives you enough time. Would that be okay? And it's open book, open notes, right? I mean, it's open Google. The only thing I kind of do not want is have you guys to work on it together. But you can use the Google to look up things. You can go to and it's going to be mostly based on the modules. So you can search within the modules as well, for certain words. Yeah. Okay. So that's the plan, and I'll contact Mark and let him know, and ask him whether he wants to kind of get in touch with all of you. If the schedule has not been determined, then you guys can kind of work on it and let him know, what your preferences are. Okay. All right. So that's what I'm gonna do. All right. Thank you. See you. Yep. All right. Good night.